Hey everyone, and welcome to another series of installation videos brought to you by Rockford Fosgate and the Rockford Technical Training Institute. In this series of videos, we're going to be taking a look at the installation process of our all-new audio system components for the Polaris Ranger side-by-side vehicles. So, without further ado, let's head inside and see how it's done. Alright guys, I am now joined by Brad with our new product development team, and he is going to help walk us through the installation of our Ranger Stage 3 audio system. So Brad, what all comes in the kit?
In our Stage 3 kit, we're including our Ranger dash kit, our PMX2 source unit, front lower pods and speakers, subwoofer enclosure and woofer for that as well, 4-channel amplifier, and all the wiring to put it in.
All right, and what's the first thing we do to get started?
First thing we're going to do is remove the hood and the top of the dash panel.
Okay, well let's get going. All right, so now that Brad has the hood out of the way, we can go ahead and move on to removing the top dash panel. Now to do this, you're going to be removing the 4 pin rivets that are located along the top side of the dash. And to do this, we're going to be utilizing a special pin rivet removal tool. However, since you probably aren't going to have this in your toolbox, a flat blade screwdriver can also be used. Just remember to be careful when you do this so you don't break those pin rivets. Okay, so now with our top dash panel removed, we can now go ahead and remove the center pocket and switch panel assembly from the dash. To do this, we're going to take our T25 torque screwdriver and remove the 2 screws located at the bottom of the panel. This will allow us to pull the panel out and disengage the wiring harnesses from the factory switches. Once that's done, we're able to bring it here to the bench, start transferring those switches to our new PMX dash kit, and prepping it to receive the PMX2 radio. Alright, so now that we have the OEM dash kit out of the vehicle and back here at the bench, we're ready to start prepping our replacement dash kit. So, Brad, is there anything special or that we need to do before we start assembling this?
Well, as you can see on this particular vehicle, we have 3 stock switches. Dash kit, we have it set for 2, which is very common on the Ranger. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and use the provided outline, cutting out our 3rd switch. And then we'll bring it back to the bench and get ready for the radio install.
All right, well, let's go see how that's done. Alright, so now that we have our 3rd switch hole cut in the new dash kit, we're ready to go ahead and move our OE switches over to the new dash kit. To this, we're going to depress the locking tabs on the backside, slide them out, and simply snap them in. Alright, so now as you can see, we have our switches transferred over to the new dash kit. Now additionally, if your model also has the factory heater installed, we do have cutout lines for you to cut out the dash kit so you can transfer your heater controls over as well. At this point, we're ready to move on to our next step. So Brad, Where do we go from here?
From here, we're going to go ahead and get out our PMX2 source unit, grab our adaptive brackets, and install it into our new dash kit.
All right, let's see how it's done.
Now that we're ready to install our PMX2 into our dash kit, we went ahead and got the rest of the parts we need. Now we got our adaptive bracket, wiring harness, zip ties and screws, and our firewall grommet. First thing we're going to do is mount our bracket into the dash kit and then our PMX2 into that. Now one thing to note, if you are using the heater kit in your Ranger, you're going to want to remove these two mounting screws off the back to allow the extra clearance. Now that we have our PMX2 mounted in our dash kit, we're going to drill a hole in the firewall to pass our wires through to the power block. Now we included a 1 3/4 inch grommet to fill the hole once you drill it. Now that we have our grommet in place, we're going to move on to installing our front lower pods. Now we include some screws that go into the factory bosses in the tray, and to make it easier, we're going to go ahead and thread them in first before installing the pod. It will just make it a little easier because they're going to be fresh threads. Now once we get those started, we'll pull them back out, put the pods in, put the 2 screws in, and then we'll be able to move on from there. Now that we have our front lower pods installed, we can go ahead and move on putting the wiring in. Now once we get our wiring run through the pod, we're going to use our sealing pad to keep them airtight. Once we get those through, we're going to put our speakers in and move on from there.
All right guys, so now that we have our front speaker pods, speakers, and speaker wiring ran up into the dash, we're ready to move on to the next step. So Brad, what's the next thing we're going to attack?
The next thing we're going to do is start by putting our wiring in for our amplifier and subwoofer enclosure. Now when we do this, we're going to start from the back of the vehicle and work our way forward.
Okay. Anything special we need to do to prep the wiring?
Well, to make it easier, we're actually going to disconnect our remote wire out of our main harness plug just to make it easier to run through the center area.
Okay, and that's going to go from the battery all the way up into the dash through the centerline tunnel, right?
Yeah, we're going to start at the battery. It just makes it a little easier working forward. That way we have all our excess up front. We don't leave ourselves, no room to connect to the battery. And we're just going to follow the main wiring harness going forward.
Okay. And as we pull that forward, then we're also going to install the primary harness for the subwoofer.
Correct. Now we're going to do, on this 4-seater, we're actually going to mount the subwoofer enclosure in the front bench seat. Now it can fit in the back as well, and we do provide enough wire for that, but for this case we're actually going to put it in the front. So when we get our power wire to the front seat, we're going to go ahead and grab our subwoofer wire and run that along with it.
All right, well let's get started with that. All right guys, so now that we have the wire harness run forward into the dash area, we're ready to go ahead and continue the installation process. So the next thing we want to do is go ahead and get the subwoofer and enclosure installed in the front seat area. Now Brad, what do we have to do to prep the woofer to go in the car?
So to prep our woofer, we're going to wire the 2 coils in series so we can get a form load since we ship it with a dual 2.
Okay, and how do we do that?
What we're going to do is flip it over, grab the included jumper wire, go from one side of the woofer's positive to the other side's negative. Just like that.
All right, and why is it important that we're wiring it as a 4-ohm one?
With our amplifier, we included the TM404. The output when it's bridged is best at a 4-ohm load.
Okay, so obviously this will match up with the amplifier.
Correct.
Okay, and now once we've got the voice coils wired together, what's the next step?
The next step we're going to do is install it to the enclosure itself, wiring up the remaining terminals before installing it. So we'll take our positive from our harness in the enclosure and the negative to the 2 open terminals that we have left. Once we have that done, we can go ahead and set it in the enclosure, mount it using the provided screws.
Okay. Now one thing to note, you'll find that when you go to install the woofer, holes are already pre-drilled in the enclosure for you. It's important that you line the woofer mounting holes with these existing holes and not make new holes. New holes are of course going to create air gaps or areas where air can come out and in turn make the woofer not sound good. Additionally, when we drop this into the vehicle, you'll notice there are 3 primary mounting holes in the pre-installed flange. These will coincide with 3 mounting bolts that you'll find underneath the seat. Now, since this is a 4-seater or type vehicle, we've also included this additional plate. Now, what is this for?
So on the 4-seater, when you install this in the front seat, the storage bins are a different size than what you would be dealing with on a 2-seat or the rear seat of the 4-seater. So we included this bracket to help fill the gap that would be left due to the oversized bin.
Okay, so this really just installs on top of and creates an extension flange, if you will, to the center section to, as you said, fill that gap. So really you're just going to lay it on there, and then when you reinstall the 3 bolts, 2 of those bolts will align with these holes, locking it in place. I see we also have double-sided foam tape. So
correct. We included 4 small strips of foam tape just in case you were to have any rattles. Now, vehicle to vehicle, it may vary, and just depending on how much use you have on your vehicle. Being this is new, I doubt we're going to have any rattles. But after you get a few miles on the vehicle, the pockets tend to slide around a little bit and loosen up. So you can actually put these on the bottom side of the metal bracket just to keep things tight.
okay, well, sounds pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and finish getting that woofer mounted and let's get it in the vehicle. All right, so now that we have the subwoofer enclosure connected in the vehicle and remounted underneath the seat using the 3 bolts that we already removed, we can move on to prepping the amp mounting plate and amplifier itself to get that in the vehicle. So Brad, tell us a little bit about how we need to install this.
So with this amplifier bracket, it's a little unique, as in we're using a tab on one side and not screws to hold the amplifier. So what you're going to do is this will be mounted in the car first using the 2 stock bolts that hold the steering column in place. Now once you get that mounted, you'll be able to take the amplifier, slide it underneath the tab, then aligning your screws on the other side. Now once all that's in place, you'll be able to connect your wires and get it playing from there.
Now when we go to install the amplifier, do we need to make sure that we position this in a certain way, or can it just go in either direction?
Yes, you're going to want to have it so the control panel is on the tab side. That way when your harness goes in, it'll align properly.
Okay, well let's see that go in.
Now that we have our amplifier mounting plate installed in the vehicle, we're ready to move on to the amplifier. Before installing it, we're going to go ahead and insert the input plugs just to make it easier when we go to mount it. One quick tip about the amplifier bracket. Now there's only 2 screws that you're going to be using to mount the amplifier. We recommend taking the screws, running them through the threads once or twice before putting the bracket in the car. That way it clears out any excess powder coat that might have got on the threads, and it'll make it easier for installing once you're in the car.
Alright, so now that we have the amplifier mounted onto the bracket, we can go ahead and start finishing the running of the cables into the dash area, which will include the subwoofer and power harness through the grommet that we installed earlier, as well as running the amplifier harness over to where the radio is located. What else do we need to run while we're up in the dash area?
Well, at this point, we'll also run our PMX2 power and ground through the grommet out to the power distribution area. And then we'll run our speaker wires over to the center area as well. Now once we have that done, we'll be able to reconnect our remote wire that we disconnected earlier to run the power and ground forward on that.
So with the harnesses routed up into the dash area where they need to be, we can go ahead and start making some of the final connections. First up, we're going to make the power connection for the PMX2 radio at the distribution block underneath the hood. Now in this case, our vehicle has just a 12-volt switched wire coming to the block and not a dedicated ground wire. Your vehicle may have both. For our instance, we're actually going to be using one of the mounting screws for the power block for our ground point for the chassis. Brad, what other connections are going to be made while we're up here?
Well, once we get our ground, we're going to go ahead and utilize the switched wire that you just talked about as our switch to the radio itself. Once we get that taken care of, we'll move to the inside of the car, connect our front speaker pod harnesses to our amplifier harness, and then continue hooking up our amplifier connections as well.
Now that we have the amplifier and power connections made in the dash, we're ready to go ahead and install our PMX2 radio and dash kit into the vehicle. Now, one thing to note, when we're making connections, because this is an amplified system, we will be connecting the RCA outputs of the PMX2 instead of utilizing the speaker connections that are found in the PMX2 harness. Additionally, we'll go ahead and reconnect the factory switch harness and install the kit using the 2 factory screws that we removed earlier. So once we get that done, Brad, what's after that?
Once we have all our connections made and the radio back in the dash, we're going to move back to the battery, connect our power and ground wires that we ran from there earlier. That way we can test the system, make sure everything works before we button it back up.
Alright, so while Brad's finishing up the connections at the battery, one last thing to note as far as an electrical connection that needs to be made. Whenever you're connecting the PMX2 radio harness to the amplifier harness, we also need to make sure that we connect the remote turn-on wire. Now, this harness wire is used to provide a signal from the radio to the amplifier to tell it to turn on. If you do not connect these 2 wires together, the amplifier will not turn on, you won't get any sound. So make sure that you do this whenever you're making those harness connections. So now with all the connections made, we're ready to check out the audio system. With the radio fired up and the amplifier on, we need to go ahead and make the final settings of the amplifier. First thing that we want to do is go ahead and set the input and crossover switches to their appropriate position. Now, this amplifier is a 4-channel amplifier, but it has an input switch in the event you're using only 2 channels of input. Since we are using all 4 channels, we want to make sure that that switch is positioned in the 4-channel position. Next, the crossover switches. The front are considered high pass, so we want to make sure that that switch is in our HP position, and the rear, which is running the subwoofer, is going to be low pass or in the LP position. For the crossover adjustments, we want to set both of those at approximately 80 Hertz. Simply rotate those around to the approximate position on the dial. The next 2 dials above it are for the punch EQ. Since this is an open air vehicle, we're going to leave those turned all the way counterclockwise or down, as it won't have very much effect in this application. Lastly, we want to adjust the output level controls or gain controls of the amplifier. To do this, we need to turn the volume of the radio up until we begin to see the input clip indicator light glow red. Once we see it turn on, we'll turn the volume down 1 notch at a time until it goes completely out. Then we will turn the front and rear output level controls up until we see the output clip indicator turn blue or bluish purple color. Since we're utilizing music for this setting, we'll expect to see that blue-purple light. Once we see it, we know the gains are set properly, and we're ready to move on from there. Alright, so now that we have the system tested and tuned, we're ready to move on with the cleanup of the wiring. Now, of course, we're going to install different zip ties, and in fact, we've included some special zip ties in with the kit. Brad, tell us a little bit about those.
So we've included these special zip ties with the Christmas tree attached for the center driveline area. There's a couple holes from the factory that these fit right into and will allow you to zip tie the wires out of the way of the drive shaft.
And once we have all the wires zip tied up and out of the way, we can go ahead, reassemble the vehicle, and get it back out on the road. Alright guys, that wraps it up for this install. As you can see, it was pretty straightforward and easy to do. So before we go, Brad, anything you want to add?
Now, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to give our tech guys a call before, during, or after your installations.
And as always, check out our YouTube channel for more installation videos or our website for more information on our products. That wraps it up for us. See you again in another video.